Hi everybody, here's the last notes for our unit on the Great Depression. We'll look at the impacts of depression, what the depression kind of impacted in the U.S., how people survived getting through depression, how it impacted certain groups as well. So starting off, we're looking at the impacts of depression. Was everybody poor in depression? And the answer to that is definitely no. Not every single person was poor. You were rich before the depression, you basically stayed rich. It was the poor that really felt the brunt of the depression. But some rich got hurt too and went downhill. I remember there was a big, huge wealth gap at this time. So if you were rich, it didn't hurt you much. But if you were poor, it definitely hurt you as well. There were some millionaires who, by the end, were selling apples on the street corner for a penny because they had no other choice. So some people did go from riches to rags. But if you were rich, a lot of times you were able to stay rich in the depression. Remember how people lived, guys. People lived, survived this whole thing. We had remember talk about 25% unemployment. You're not working, not making food, not making money, not buying food. A lot of times, bread lines, soup kitchens got started. A lot of times by churches, those kind of things got those going. Charity organizations. They had a big issue with malnourishment. Malnourishment is when you don't have enough to eat, especially for kids. Looking at the medical records at the time, they said there wasn't a ton of death by that, but obviously the medical records at the time may not be the greatest either. But definitely, yeah, remember that not having a lot of food, people were definitely undernourished, at least not getting enough food to live a perfect life. Homelessness. We talked about Hoovervilles. We did Hoovervilles before. Hobo camps in terms of being on the road and migrating. The big part of it for those poor who lost their homes during this time as well. Women and kids. The 20s were a time of fun. 20s were a time to hang out and let loose and party and all those kind of things. And 30s weren't that way. I mean, my grandma tells stories of growing up in the depression of, we didn't do anything. We stayed at home. We didn't do much. I mean, she was a little girl during the depression. She was 8, 9, 10 years old. Um, Kids had to really help support the family again. She talks about working on the farm. She would put to work right away. Where before that maybe she had to hang out or do fun stuff with her friends, whatever it was. Um, you know, some kids actually ran away from home. They left home because they felt they were a burden on their family. These guys up here, they go ride the rails, ride train cars, go find somewhere else, make a better life, and they make life a little easier for their mom and dad because they would have to support, especially their older kids. They had younger siblings to support. Some families got really close, some families fell apart because of depression. Depending on the situation. Some families, you banded together, you worked really hard together. Some families broke up because just wasn't enough money to support everybody. We also see women working outside the home here, especially in terms of maid service and that kind of stuff, where it's easier for women to get jobs in some cases, especially minority women get jobs in those kind of places versus men, because of the type of work that was acceptable at that time. Minority-wise, minorities always had it worse than whites. A lot of times, minorities were last hired, first fired. Um, and unfortunately, there were no laws at the time about racial hiring laws and those kind of things that you could discriminate based off of race. And so a lot of times, a white employee would be kept versus a minority employee. A lot of women had it easier to find work because of the whole servant idea. If you've seen the movies like The Help, those kind of things, it was easier for minority women to find work, especially for Hispanic. Hispanic especially got hit hard in the Southwest with migrants moving from Oklahoma and Arkansas to California. A lot of Mexicans got deported. Actually, even Mexican citizens who were U.S. citizens, they were born here. They may have been here for a long, long time because they had a last name that was Hispanic. They were deported because of fear of taking jobs, that kind of thing that was happening. So how did people survive during this time? For those who were poor, well, there was a company that decided to sell apples to people. Okay, they sold apples on credit, and then people would then sell those apples on a street corner for a nickel a piece. So you see people ever become apple sellers, if you will, and you kind of get that stereotype of people selling apples during the Depression. It's in Annie and those kind of movies like that. People who are begging on the street corners, that kind of stuff was going on, panhandling, those kind of things. Um, Families live together. Grandparents, aunts, uncles may cram big families into one little spot. Biggest thing was being frugal. I mean, you saved everything, you reused everything, and if you know people live through the depression, you still see it today. You see depression era people saving toilet paper tubes. We'll use these someday. You see them saving saving napkins. My grandmother saves paper plates because we might be able to use these later for something. My grandmother too, the idea of canning. I was thinking about my grandmother living through the depression. Her, my grandfather had a huge cellar in the basement that they just stocked full of food just in case something happened. If there's a sale on canned beans, all right, for she would buy 3, 4 cases of them. They're still down there, probably from 10 years ago. Just because the idea that you would have enough food there. But people grew their food in the garden. They canned it. That kind of stuff to make sure that it would last for a long, long time. They could use it when and if they needed it. They even got away with making their own clothes. I read a story online about making dresses out of wheat sacks and those kind of things for girls and that kind of stuff. I mean, younger couples, they put off marriage. They just didn't have marriage. Families put off having kids. They just couldn't afford them. Some guys left their families. Some men who were so embarrassed that they had lost their job and couldn't support their wife and kids just left home. They were so embarrassed that pride was such a big hit. And they would hop on a train, ride the rails, go to California, try to send money back home if they could. Take one of the PWA jobs, making stuff somewhere just to support their family. So the idea here is that really those who are hurt by the depression, they found that you had to find a way to survive. What it came down to, you had to find a way to survive, and people did find ways to survive, whatever they had to do and what kind of sacrifices they had to make. And learning from people who lived through depression, and unfortunately, a lot of those people are in their 90s now, and they're a lot more than they're being lost every single day. The ideas are still with them today. They imparted some of those ideas on their kids as well. But as I think about my grandmother and my grandfather, and how they were acting, they definitely did save everything. They found ways to we could use this some other place. We might use this for a rainy day kind of thing in case something happens. Even in terms of paying with how they pay for things. Even my grandmother, she always pays with cash. My grandmother I never ever see my grandmother use a debit card or a credit card. Don't just say it's because she's old. All right, she doesn't have a checkbook either. She keeps every single thing in cash, and it all comes back to living during the Depression when she was growing up, and how her parents acted and those kind of things. Going from there, guys, farmers. With farmers being foreclosed on, when the banks had to auction the farm off to pay off the collateral loan, a lot of times they have these big auctions to auction that farm off. And communities actually banded together trying to help people keep their farms. They had what was called penny auctions, where the neighbors would get together and they would only bid a few cents at a time. And basically was a way to essentially, screw the banks over, because they were trying to stop the banks from foreclosing, saying, hey, have some faith in us, that kind of stuff. In fact, if you were an outsider who went there to get a cheap farm or a cheap place, it was dangerous for you because they would take you out back and kick your butts. You were encouraged to be like, hey, buddy, you're bidding a little high there, aren't you? And take them out of the crowd to make sure that they weren't bidding. That way, you could just farm for a few pennies, and the bank would have no incentive really to keep foreclosing on people. Sometimes you sell an entire farm, house, barn, equipment, animals, and only make 15, 20 bucks for the bank. And it's kind of a way to keep the banks down a little bit. You have people who are called Arkies and Okies. People who are hurt by the Dust Bowl, who left their farms that are foreclosed on, headed out to California working as migrant workers. So working in the vegetable fields there, picking peas, picking grapes, that kind of stuff, cotton, those kind of deals. Dorothea Lange was a very, very famous photographer who took photos of these migrants for the government. She worked for one of the Farm Service Bureaus. And so she took all his photos and published his photos, including the famous one here, Migrant Mother. And it's kind of cool. You see this photo here. This photo over here is then I believe the same person, I believe, in that photo. It's kind of cool to just kind of see, that photo, these, photos of the time period. All the photos we looked at in class as well were Dorothea Lange photos that were showing, those migrant trips. So, question is, depression. Sounds very depressing, right? Was there any fun? Was there anything fun going on? Of course there was. There was fun going on. I mean, the same stuff in the 20s was still popular. Baseball was still a big deal. Sporting events were still a big deal. The biggest thing was movies. I mean, movies was a huge deal. I mean, even movies that are starting coming in Technicolor now, all that kind of stuff. I mean, some of the great classics from this time, like Gone with the Wind, Wizard of Oz. Disney gets its start during this time, so some of the first Disney flicks are coming out. And I mean, if you could afford to go to the movies, it was definitely a treat. I mean, it was a dime to go to a double feature a lot of times. 10 cents, 2 movies, popcorn was a nickel. Be a way to spend an afternoon that was, wasn't, it was, an expense, obviously, but, it was something fun you could do. People were always playing outside. Kids were finding ways to keep themselves entertained. My grandma talked about, playing games and making your own games, that kind of stuff. Radio was still popular. People still had radios from the 20s. They had programming just like TV today, would be sitcoms, or whether it be soap operas, all that kind of stuff. I mean, people still had them. People still had their cars. Gas was still, pretty reasonable. You could go camping, have some fun, cheap entertainment if you had it left over from the 20s. Culture-wise, one of the best examples we have of culture is John Steinbeck was an author who wrote about the Depression. And really kind of cool about the Depression. John Steinbeck wrote a couple different books that was set during this time period, like the Grapes of Wrath, which is about the Okies heading out west from, after as a migrant laborer. Of Mice and Men, about two men who are, wandering around trying to find work during the Depression. Great books to read. I'm reading Of Mice and Men again right now. I read it back in high school. I'm reading it again, just to kind of get the idea of the book again. But it's really interesting to kind of just see, how the culture is recorded in these books. Electricity-wise, electricity became a big part of the New Deal. Something called the Rural Electrification Act, where power poles got strung out and trying to get all the farms electrified, electric lights, those kind of things. People can now stay up later, enjoy themselves, read, really, and have those appliances and status. If you didn't use those appliances all the time because you didn't have electricity, it was still a really good status symbol for you that, hey, you know what, we had some left over from the Depression here. Women in a way advances during this time a little bit. Eleanor Roosevelt really helped people out a lot in terms of female reporters, those kind of things. There was a Marian Anderson, African American opera singer, she was a soprano, who was supposed to perform for the Daughters of American Republic, American Revolution, and she was not allowed to perform for them because she's African American. Eleanor Roosevelt quit the Daughters of American Revolution and actually gave a concert for her at Lincoln Memorial. Got let her sing. Kind of cool things to see an advancement like that. Women work outside the home a lot. They joined the labor unions at this time. Frances Perkins, being the Secretary of Labor, made a big deal in that. So women, in some ways, actually do kind of advance in this time as well. Minorities, for African Americans, there's still Jim Crow. There's still lynchings that are taking place in this time here. Really, the New Deal did very, very little for African Americans. No civil rights laws were made. A lot of those got pressed off. There's a lynching bill that came up in the mid-30s that got voted down. So really, African Americans got no help from the New Deal. FDR did have what's called the Black Cabinet. It was a group of African American advisors, people that were upper class, upper African Americans, involved in the universities, those kind of things that helped advise them. But really, nothing really came for African Americans out of the 30s, except more problems. We'll talk about the 30s more when we talk about civil rights with Martin Luther King Jr. all that kind of stuff. We'll kind of skip back to the 30s and talk about things like some of the things that were happening since the 30s. To the 50s. For Native Americans, there's one big thing that happens to Native Americans. Unfortunately, for Native Americans, they're the poorest of the poor during this time. The average Native American family on a reservation made upwards of $48 a year. Yeah, that's not a lot of money, right? And one of the things that the New Deal did was something called the Indian Reorganization Act, where it brought back the reservations that have been gotten rid of during the Dawes Act. So it brought back, tribal ownership of land versus private ownership of land, and allowed, the Native American culture to come back. That'd be language, that'd be all those things come back for the Native Americans. It was huge for Native American rights, even though they were still hurt by the Depression and hurt by the decisions that had been made prior to that. They got back their land, got back their tribal ownership of land, got back some of their culture, which was a huge deal for them. Labor-wise, unions actually gained strength. There are actually more strikes during this time than before, which is really kind of weird when you think about it. But workers want to try and get more rights. The Wagner Act, which we talked about last notes, was big in terms of legalizing union ownership, legalizing unions, those kind of things. And before we saw when unions went on strikes, they would strike outside the building. Well, think about it. There's so many guys that are out of work right now. A strike outside the building is not going to do anything because, well, they'll find new workers. So the unions created something called a sit-down strike, where actually the employees would just sit down on the job and literally occupy the building. That way, no work could be done, and you have to force to pay more, better hours, whatever it might be. Some people argue that the labor movements at the time really slowed down the economy because, they're going on strike, trying to get rights, that kind of stuff. But, at the same time, we look at the modern day labor ideas and rights come out of labor, it really helps enforce that. There was something called the Congress of Industrial Organizations, basically a new idea for a labor union where it was all workers, okay, not just skilled workers, not just a certain group of workers, but all workers, skilled, unskilled, black, white, male, female, become a part of the labor unions and get right and help to get workers' rights, those kind of things. All right, what if you think lasting legacies? One big idea here is bigger government, and we'll talk about this more next week. But you see more people employed by government now. The government becomes a huge employer of people, whether it be through, administration, new ideas, new departments within the presidential branch of the government. That kind of stuff is going on here. The president has a lot more power now. They're trying to set prices and fix agriculture problems, things that in the Constitution might not be necessarily the power of the president. The government also spends a lot more money now, and they do it through deficit spending, going into debt. So we see national debts that are creeping up here because of that. And really, the debate keeps on going. We'll talk about the debate later on, too, here is who should provide welfare for people? Should it be the government, or should it be charitable organizations and individual people? So that kind of debate keeps going here about, who provides welfare, who helps people out when they need it. By the way, is anything from the New Deal still around yet today? You better believe it. Social Security, still happening today yet, okay? FDIC, that group that insures the bank, still happening. And also the SEC, the Security Exchange Commission, who watches stock markets, protects investors against problems, that kind of thing. Thanks a lot, guys. Study hard.